What's up, everybody? Welcome to Fed by Fire. I'm Christian Whitlow, and I just want to talk about something that's been exploding in the media, this Carmelo Anthony and Austin Metcalf case. So we're going to talk about it start to finish, but we're also going to talk about what it actually turns into once the internet gets a hold of it and involved, because right now this is one of those cases where people aren't even looking at the same reality anymore. You know, depending on what clip they saw first, this happens at a high school track meet in Frisco, Texas. Normal day, rain tent set up, athletes waiting it out, parents around, coaches, just a regular school environment. Nothing about it is supposed to turn into anything life-changing, but it does. And then there's an interaction between Carmelo Anthony and Austin Metcalf. And that starts off verbal, words being exchanged, tension building, ego involved. And this is where people underestimating how fast things actually move in real time. Because from what's been laid out in reports and testimony, this doesn't stay verbal for long. It escalates into a confrontation, it becomes physical, and at some point in that moment, Carmelo Anthony pulls a knife and Austin Metcalf is stabbed in the chest. And that right there is the point where everything stops being normal and everything after that becomes permanent. So Austin Metcalf doesn't survive that injury. A teenager goes from being at a track meet to being gone. And that's the part that gets buried under everything else that comes later. Because the first reality of this case is just that somebody died in a setting where nobody expects death to even be part of the equation. Carmelo Anthony is arrested on the spot and charged. The argument from the defense side becomes self-defense, that he felt threatened in that moment, and that things escalated to a point where he believed he had to protect himself. The prosecution comes in completely opposite, saying this was not justified, that Austin was unarmed, and that there was no reason for deadly force to be used in that moment or in that situation. And that's what started the argument turned into an unnecessary killing. And that once that legal process starts, the case stops being just about what happened in the moment and starts becoming something else entirely, because now the system is involved, law enforcement's building the timeline, witness statements get collected, lawyers start shaping narratives, and the public gets fragments of all of this through headlines and clips that get reposted and stripped of context. And that's where the internet takes over, you guys, because now it's not just Carmelo Anthony and Austin Metcalf anymore. Now it's opinions, now it's sides, now it's people arguing about self-defense law like they were in the courtroom. And now it's people arguing about intent like they were standing under the tent that day. Now it's people attaching bigger meanings to it. Race conversations, school violence conversations, justice system conversations, and all of that starts stacking on top of the actual event until the event itself basically gets fucking lost. And I always think about that shift because I've seen it happen a lot in a lot of cases where the human part gets smaller every day, but the discourse gets louder. And Austin Metcalf becomes a name people use to argue, and Carmelo Anthony becomes a name people use to argue. And it should be more than that, because the actual families get pushed further and further away from the conversation that's happening about them. And I'm not saying that people aren't allowed to talk or have opinions, because it's America, about it, because obviously people are going to have opinions. That's just how the world works. But there's a difference between understanding a tragedy and turning it into a battlefield. Because once it becomes a battlefield, nobody is really listening anymore. Everybody is just waiting for their turn to respond. And what gets lost is how small the moment actually was compared to massive consequences are. This wasn't months of planning. This wasn't a long-standing situation. This was a short window of time, a confrontation at a school event, and in that short window, everything changed permanently for multiple people, multiple families at the same time. And that's the part I keep coming back to, because I think about my own life in high school. And I wasn't perfect. I got into fights at school events. I had those moments where pride takes over and you're not thinking long term whatsoever. You're thinking about what's happening right in front of you, and that's it. And who's watching, who said what, who backed down, all that stupid teenage bullshit logic that feels massive in the moment but doesn't matter at all in the real world. And I always sit back with the same thought when I hear cases like this. If one of those moments in my life had escalated just a little further, if somebody had made a different decision in a split second, I wouldn't be sitting here right now talking about it. I'd be on the other side of the courtroom system, just like Carmelo. That doesn't care about your background. Once a life is gone, that's it. Because that's another thing people don't fully grasp until they see it up close. Once somebody dies, the system doesn't measure feelings anymore. It measures outcomes. It measures actions. It measures decisions in seconds, not intentions over time. And then, while that's happening in court, the public is running its own trial online and in public. And those two things don't ever really line up cleanly, because one is based on evidence and law, and the other is based on emotion and identity and whatever narrative people already believed before they even saw the facts. That's just what it is. So you end up with this split reality where two things are happening at once, a legal process trying to determine responsibility, and a public conversation trying to turn it into meaning. And I think that's where a lot of division comes from, because instead of setting with the reality that this is a tragedy involving two young men who lost their life, two young people whose lives went completely opposite directions, in seconds, it gets turned into something way bigger than it's supposed to be. And when it gets turned into something bigger than, it becomes easier for people to disconnect from the human side of it, and it becomes easier to argue. It becomes easier to pick a side. It becomes easier to treat it like a story instead of something that actually fucking happened to real people. But at the core of it, no matter how people frame it, no matter what angle they take, the reality stays the same. Two teenagers lost their lives. Another teenager, he's going to be in there. His life is being shaped by that moment. The two families are left dealing with something that they can't undo. And everybody else left with a conversation that keeps repeating itself every time a case like this hits the internet. And I think the only real question worth sitting with is not which side people are on, but why we keep letting every one of those moments turn into something that divides people who aren't even there. Because at some point, if every tragedy just becomes another reason to separate further, then we're not actually learning anything from any of it. We're just watching the same cycle repeat over and over and over again as a society with different names attached to it. That's my rant. Thank you guys. Prayers to Austin's family. I hope they, prayers out to them. This is a tragedy. Prayers out to Carmelo's family. Regardless of it all, this was a mistake. And I know he has to see it that way. And, I'm Noah. This is just my 2 cents. Thank you guys for watching. Like and subscribe. I got more fire coming y'all's way.